everybody. My name is Joe Tierney, and thank you for tuning in to the Gentleman Toker podcast. I am the Gentleman Toker. I started a website of the same name back in 2016 to help people find the best cannabis products that were springing up in DC once they legalized cannabis here. Since then, I've traveled all over the country to legalized states to check out their markets. And what we want to do with this podcast is teach you about the weed scenes in each of these states so that you can be a savvy ganja tourist when you are out and about in Colorado or Seattle or New York City or New Jersey or whatever. But today we're starting with DC, and the reason we're starting with DC is because that's where we started the website. So today we're actually going to be talking a good bit about Initiative 71. We were planning to address, some of the specifics of how to get weed in DC, but there's been some recent legislative changes, and I think that we've got to shift gears and talk about all the exciting things that are happening in DC right now. And we are joined by my co-host for today, Caroline Phillips. Caroline is the founder and leader behind the National Cannabis Festival that happens every year for cannabis to celebrate 420, basically, right?
I think so. Yeah, that's why we got together.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just enjoy, our new legalization that we have here in DC.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today. I've, of course, been reading your blog since 2016, and that's something that we have in common. Both of our ideas came to fruition starting in 2016, and we've gotten to kind of grow side by side over the years since.
Absolutely.
But, I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about National Cannabis Festival, but also talk to you a bit about Initiative 71 and all of the excitement that's been happening over the past few weeks.
Well, we certainly appreciate you being here. All right, so if you're curious about what Initiative 71 is, Initiative 71 was the measure that DC passed to legalize cannabis with the intent of creating a retail tax and sales system. That was originally what was supposed to happen. Unfortunately, congressional Republicans, led by Andy Harris,
Boo.
Thank you, Andy Harris, who actually is from a state that was implementing a medical marijuana program and would suddenly find itself in competition with the district, decided to add what would hereafter be called the Harris Rider to the federal spending budget. So do you want to kind of explain why DC is under, this Harris Rider to begin with?
Absolutely. So Washington, D.C. is not a state. We have taxation here, but no representation in Congress, at least no real votes. And every year we have to get our city budget approved by Congress, and they can say, yes, that works for us. Well, when the residents of Washington, D.C. voted nearly 70% in favor of passage of Initiative 71, that pissed off a couple of people in Congress, and Andy Harris was one of them, and he slapped a rider on our budget that said, if the mayor of D.C., if the council, if D.C. moves forward and creates a taxed and regulated cannabis industry in the city, then there's going to be trouble. And basically the threat went so far as putting our mayor and members of our D.C. council in jail, and it also threatened to pull funds from important social services. So overall, not a good look for Andy Harris, and certainly not a great impact on our city and the will of our voters.
Absolutely. I mean, retail tax and sales is what they wanted, and we ended up in this kind of middle ground for the next 5 years.
One thing I can say, you and I both started our respective projects in 2016, National Cannabis Festival and the Gentleman Toker blog. When you started in 2016, could you imagine that, is it 6 years later now, that we would still be chasing our tails, considering exactly when DC would get a fully taxed and regulated adult use program?
Oh, man. I mean, from my perspective, I've thought the sky was falling every single year since it happened. You know, feeling a little like Chicken Little. It eventually got to a point where I was just like, you know what? I don't care. It happens when it happens. I'll believe it when I see it. Even with the most recent threat to end the I-71 market, I was still kind of like, yeah, okay, let's see if this actually happens. You know, we've been the city government has talked about getting this retail tax and sales program together for years, like every single year. They talk about doing it, and they talk about going against the I-71 market and so on. And so far, nothing has really changed.
It is, I mean, we're definitely living in interesting times. I can tell you with certainty that when I came up with the idea for National Cannabis Festival, I would not have predicted that 6 years later it would sort of feel like the festival was living at the intersection of the difficulties and the challenges around DC law, but I also think that the festival reflects a lot of the great opportunities that we have with the cannabis community in our city. But perhaps I was a little bit naive about the legislative process, but I really didn't imagine that 6 years later, the folks in Congress would have the balls to continue to oppress the will of DC's voters.
Oh yeah, yeah, and you know we're just getting into a situation where the city leadership feels comfortable at least discussing what could happen if the Harris rider is gone, right? Because on paper, Congress is a Democrat majority. We've got a Democrat in the Oval Office. So it seems like we've kind of got that perfect storm to actually make this happen. In practice, however, it doesn't really seem like so much of a Democrat majority. In fact, they haven't really been able to push any of their agenda. And, you know, I read a recent newsletter from DC Marijuana Justice saying that they're hearing that the Harris rider is going to make a return, that it's coming back from the grave to continue to grip DC. And, you know, I expect that it's going to have you know, a lot of the same impact in terms of Maryland is considering recreational legalization. Virginia has already passed it.
Can you believe that Virginia is like creeping past us as far as progressive laws on cannabis?
I cannot, and I am so mad. I cannot tell you how I'm spitting mad that Virginia is surpassing Maryland and DC. You know they're allowing home growing? I could have stayed in Virginia this whole time.
And the rent, I hear, is a little better that way. But also shout out to Jen Michelle Padini and the entire Virginia Normal family for kicking ass and getting that legislation through last July.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is that was an impressive piece of legislation that came out. I was super happy to read it and super frustrated that I take up residence in Maryland now. So I'm still waiting home grow. You think I don't want to grow plants in my backyard? I so want to grow plants in my backyard.
You're just chasing cannabis around the Beltway at this point.
Really, really. They can't just, you know, it's definitely a bit of a shell game, me trying to like keep up everywhere. And, you know, I think that home growing is so, which is, you know, we need to talk about Initiative 71, and I think that's probably the most important component of it, right?
Right. I mean, home growing is true social equity, the ability to grow and provide for yourself, to be able to grow your own medicine, to soothe your own aches and pains, or whatever it is you're using it for. That is true social equity.
And it creates a check against the, you know, retail market. That if you're not able to provide products at a fair price that are high quality, then I will do it myself. So I love that aspect of it, and I hope that you know, more states adopt that. From what I could see in, you know, legislation they're considering in DC going forward, they're not going to do anything against home growing. So I'm really glad to see that. But yeah, let's talk about Initiative 71 a little bit.
Let's do it.
At the basics, as we've talked about, it allows home growing. So a single individual can grow up to 6 plants in their residence.
And up to 4 people in a residence, right?
I believe it only doubles.
Okay.
So no matter how many people you have in there,
You can
your
only
limit,
go up to 12 plants.
Yep, is 12 plants. Half of them can be flowering at any given time. So that's the last stage before harvest of the marijuana plant. And so you can have 6 kind of, you know, in propagation or, you know, vegetative state or whatever. But once they're getting ready to harvest, you can't have more than 3 or 6 at most if you have 2 people in your residence. So beyond that, Initiative 71 allows for possession. You can possess up to 2 ounces. You can, and here's the real kicker of I-71 is that they allow for the transfer of up to 1 ounce between adults that are 21 or older. So I think you see where I'm going with this. This is the state that we were left in as citizens of DC. And at the time, I lived here. I moved here. That's what I was going to say earlier. I mean, I remember I was watching Mayor Bowser on TV from the hospital, but I was watching her on TV be threatened by Congress with going to jail. They were going to arrest the whole city council. They said, "Oh yeah, we're going to get you if you guys try to move forward with legalization." You know, I couldn't have been. For me, it was a real emotional moment because you know I was finally seeing like, you know, my city's leadership stand up for me and my rights as a cannabis consumer, and so it was really important to me to see that. And I've always been really thankful for Mayor Bowser and the city leadership for standing up and doing that. So when they did that, essentially this turned into a negotiation. This is a great negotiation for politics, right? Because everybody walked away unhappy.
Yep.
Congressional Republicans did not end up prohibiting legalization in the district. However, they did prevent the district from taxing it and really benefiting from legalization the way that states like Colorado have.
Well, and allowing us to institute our own regulations in the city that work for our community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it left us all in this, you know, middle ground where legalization, possession was legal, transferring was legal, growing is legal, but selling was not legal. What happened next?
Well, what happened next is Washington, D.C. is one of the most creative places that I know, and it's a city full of very bright and innovative entrepreneurs. And it didn't take folks long to really take a look at Initiative 71 and come up with their own interpretations of it and start to develop businesses around this new set of laws in the city.
Exactly. So we people figured out a loophole, and there's been a lot of questions over the years about like its legality. But what I know about it is, you know, it's addressed specifically. So they've got some new legislation planned for if that Harris rider is removed,
Right.
that deals specifically with saying we're not going to allow this anymore, which means kind of like de facto it was legal. And I've also heard, you know, well, police raids and things like that have been commonplace throughout I-71. I've never heard of a single conviction that wasn't related to somebody having some other charge,
Right.
like they were distributing some other drug or they had firearms.
Right.
Or were somehow over state lines or something like that. So every time it came to court, the GC judiciary is like, yeah, we don't want to deal with this. So, you know, it's you know, people were following the rules as much as we could figure, right? And I could find a dozen lawyers, and half of them will tell you one thing, and half of them will tell you the other thing. So there wasn't really any clear guidance. It was more like, I think the city tolerated it for a while, so long as it wasn't big.
Well, and I do think that I know this hasn't been true across the board, but I do know that since Initiative 71 became law, we have seen a decrease in arrests for cannabis in our city.
Yes, we have.
Unfortunately, the arrests that are still happening still by and large impact Black and brown members of our community and folks living in more vulnerable wards in our city. But I do think that the overall goal to reduce the number of people being put in jail for a plant, we've started to work in that direction. We've made some good progress. So that is, I think, the most important thing for me that came out of Initiative 71. And also just, again, the opening of people's eyes to home grow and what a valuable skill and what a valuable privilege that is that we have in our city.
And that's a really good point in that, you know, there are still people being arrested. And, you know, there are people that are not allowed to partake in home growing. And that is if you are living in federal housing.
They can't even consume their medicine if they're living in federal housing. I don't know if you saw the letter that HUD sent to Congresswoman Norton today.
No, I
But
didn't.
yeah, she'd written to HUD and she said, I'd really like my cannabis patients living in federal housing to be able to medicate without fear of being evicted from their homes. And, HUD wrote back and they're like, this isn't really our thing to differentiate right now. We can't make this decision for you because of the status of cannabis federally.
How many times have we heard that over the last few years? I think we were talking about that earlier in that, the federally illegal status of cannabis that persists is just creating a host of other problems that have yet to be resolved. And that's one of them. That's a big one of them. Would you attribute like the ongoing arrests also to, people that are using in and around, federal housing? Is that where it's happening, or?
I think that we definitely live in a city of two cities. There are people who are doing just fine. They can use cannabis safely, privately in their home, and they've been doing so for decades and decades and decades without being criminalized or told that they're bad people for doing it. Then we have other folks that live in our city that maybe don't have as much privacy. Maybe they don't have a big yard they can walk into and tuck into a corner. Maybe they live in public housing and they get treated very differently. And, that's something that we all need to be aware of as we're building this industry in this city, that we're, dangling this great medicine, this great business opportunity in front of some folks who just don't even have a chance right now to participate. And I think, that hurts a lot. And I really
Yeah.
hope that, I hope to see better laws in DC, but when we get the federal laws changed, it's going to be really great for those folks who can finally medicate at home, can finally be open about how they choose to live their lives.
Agree. Federal legalization is going to solve a lot of these problems while coming up with a host of its own. We're realistic.
That, I think, is a next fair question. So I know that in DC, we've spent the past 6 years, I know I have, looking around, when is this going to happen for us? Damn the Harris rider. In a way, though, has there been any silver lining in your mind to the Harris rider? Do you think the slow roll on adult use in DC has given us all a chance to really reflect on the kind of laws we want in our city, the kind of community we want to build around it, the kind of equitable opportunities we want to make available to other people? Because you do hear about places that have just flipped the switch and everything's legal, but then you hear about large companies storming in and taking all of the opportunities. The community doesn't even have a chance to learn what's available.
Absolutely. That's one of the highlights of Initiative 71, and making the cannabis industry available to anyone. I've always looked at it as the grand experiment in legalization is what Washington D.C. has, and there are some states that have adopted its rules.
Yes, there are, and even countries that have adopted rules very close to what we're doing here in DC.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
I think, what's most impressive to me, especially going into, oh God, is it going into year 6 now? It's been going on for a
Next year's
long
year
time.
7.
Okay, all right. I don't know if my heart can take that. But one of the things that's great about it is that, at this point, I'm seeing the market stabilize. In terms of, early on, there was a lot of big personalities. There was a lot of drama on the internet, personal clashes and stuff like that, as a number of, the people that are willing to take this kind of risk, tend to be bigger, brasher personalities that think they're doing things the right way, and they come into
The squeakiest wheel is
conflict.
always the loudest.
So, and that was a fantastic phase of it. I'll never forget my trial on Facebook that I got pulled into from the big group that was operating on Facebook at the time. But it's that's one great thing about it, is that we had all that early on, but now we've kind of stabled out.
Yeah.
A lot more stable ownership. We're seeing more partnerships. In fact, until recently, my understanding is that some of the animosity between the medical marijuana market that exists in DC and the Initiative 71 brands had kind of abated, and people had friendlier relations.
I was talking, this was probably a year or so ago. Maybe it was before the pandemic. It's all a little confusing. Maybe a year ago. Anyway, I was talking to one of the cultivation center owners in DC a year or two ago. And, we were talking about, he's like, I coexist with all of these other companies in the city. And I asked him, well, how is that for you? And I was definitely expecting him to be like, I can't believe all these people are able to do business. But what he said to me, I think, is important, and it's something that we should all really think about, no matter which side of the table you are on in this issue. He said to me, Caroline, sometimes I go buy my food at Whole Foods. Sometimes I go to Aldi. Occasionally, I head to Costco and buy a shit ton of food. Sometimes I hit the drive-thru. Sometimes I'm going to do something like go grab some wings at the 7-Eleven, which I personally think is really daring, but I had a bad taquito experience like 10 years ago at the 7-Eleven. I haven't forgotten it. But his point to me was all of these places do business. There's the guy that will charge you $200 for a steak up the street. He's in business. And then there's the person down the street that will charge you $7 for a cheesesteak. That person's in business too. And his point was that there are different businesses that please different kind of customers, and that if his business was running well and running right and he was doing his best job as a cultivator, he's like, I'm not worried about the other businesses. I'm so busy running mine and getting my product out to the dispensaries, and they're getting my product out to patients, that, it doesn't bother me if someone chooses to go to the corner store or chooses to go to the 7-Eleven. And I was talking to actually one of the advocacy committee partners from National Cannabis Festival the other day about this as well, and we were talking about the idea of legalizing cannabis like alcohol. Well, where can you buy alcohol? Sometimes it's at the grocery store. Sometimes it's at the gas station. Sometimes it's the corner store, and sometimes you go to the really nice specialty liquor store. And,
Absolutely.
So somewhere in there, I think, is a path forward for cannabis, not just in DC, but nationwide.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's a lot of different ways that you can run a cannabis business that are more advantageous for some people than others. For years, I support people whether they want to have a medical card or not. I think there's very valid reasons for not getting a medical card while federal legalization persists to be illicit. Sorry, that was
federal
a
employee.
jumble.
It was, but I'm going to save you. Yeah, like if you're a federal employee or you're a veteran, like putting your name down on that medical card that could have implications.
Absolutely, and especially if you're in Washington D.C., a lot of people are very career oriented. They are politically active or have political
There's security
aspirations.
clearances involved.
That's what. Yep, military. And especially, with the research being done and how it can help with PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you really think we'd like to get some cannabis in these guys' hands, and we can't. And, with it being federally illegal still, there is plenty of reasons not to get a medical marijuana card that are perfectly valid. There's also some good reasons to get one. If you really are treating a specific medical ailment and you find something that works for you, when you go to the dispensary, you can count on finding that same strain or product in circulation for years.
Yeah.
Which is just such a great peace of mind as a patient versus the I-71 market where things fluctuate a lot and something that you find today might not be available next week.
Right.
So, there's perfectly valid reasons for both. We were discussing that, there's plenty of good reasons to want to use the Initiative 71 market. And we were talking about kind of the growth that we've seen over the years. I had mentioned, all the people and personalities that showed up at the beginning, how things have kind of smoothed out now. And specifically regarding that, I mean that, I've been to New York City recently, I've been to New Jersey, I've been to places that are kind of in the same in-between state as DC is. And it takes hours to get it. I mean, it takes a long time. Like, you have to book your delivery like 24 hours in advance. Like in DC, that thing is at your door like within 2 hours, within 1 hour, like a lot of the time. So, and the prices are competitive. The products are competitive. Everybody's, it's a capitalist dream, right?
I mean, it's been incredible watching this evolve from, November of 2014 until now. So I don't know if you know this. Were you in November of 2014? Where were you on election night?
November of 2014 election night. Man,
Taking it way back.
That's a good question. A lot of my life is fuzzy.
But this is an important night. This was the night that we voted yes on Initiative 71.
So I technically was not a resident at that time.
Okay.
I lived in Alexandria.
We'll let you slide on that for now. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell too many people that, though.
I try to keep
Actually,
I tell everybody because it's
we
kind
love Virginia.
We do. But at this particular place, see, I had moved into this apartment complex that was full of like military and law enforcement people, and I didn't know that moving in.
So they weren't like passing you the bong on election night.
My downstairs neighbor, I heard her in more than one heated discussion about whether or not they wanted to bust me for smoking a bowl on my balcony. And I'm very clearly like not a dealer. I don't have people coming in and out all the time. I would just puff a bowl and then move on with my day. So when Initiative 71 happened, I was paying very close attention, and I may be the cannabis refugee with the shortest trip ever.
That's
I only
hysterical.
moved a few miles, but over a very important border that gave me peace of mind going forward.
Here is where I was. So in 2014, I became a patient at a medical dispensary in DC, which is its own ridiculous story of how I thought, anyway. It's a ridiculous story of how I thought the process would work, and that I thought I needed to present with like a visible ailment. We can talk about that another day. But over the months that I'd been going to this dispensary, I started to recognize a couple of people from around my neighborhood. And this was a really exciting moment for me because at the time I was working in human rights, and I would, leave my house in the morning in my pencil skirt and shoes and costume jewelry and get on the train and go downtown. And I'd work till 5 o'clock, and then I would dart out of the office, get back to my house, run an errand or two, and then smoke a blunt or two. Now, this had been my great shame and big secret for many years, because it just didn't square with what I'd been told was the right behavior for, a professional who was working in Washington, D.C. And for a long time, I was really, truly I better not let anyone know about this. But I started to see these other nice people from my neighborhood in the dispensary, and it occurred to me that perhaps this thing that I would do to relax at night and to sleep better wasn't so bad. So I spoke to the person who was running the dispensary at the time, and I said, there's an election night coming up, and I know the vote's on Initiative 71. Wouldn't it be fun if we had a mixer for the other dispensary patients? So we got together. We went over to Meridian Pint in Columbia Heights, and we got DC Brow involved, and we decided to put on a happy hour with a couple of the advocacy groups. I didn't really know much about the volume of advocates in DC around cannabis at the time. And I certainly wasn't aware of the public interest. So that night at Meridian Hill Pint, we ended up in a situation, it was a fundraiser, where we raised a ton of money for DC Central Kitchen, but we also ended up in a one person in, one person out situation. There was no cannabis being consumed on the premises, but people were so enthusiastic to have this out in public event happening where they could be around other advocates and enthusiasts and celebrate this vote together. They were coming out in droves, and we had press lined up all the way around the curb that night. That evening, I left the event, and I was just really excited. I was like, all of these people, and they love cannabis, and I love cannabis. This is wonderful. A few months later, I was asked to produce what ended up being the first cannabis conference in DC, and that was a very different experience. So this did all sort of start with the vote on Initiative 71. At that event, I walked into the conference room on the day of the event, and I really didn't see a reflection of our community here in DC. I saw a lot of people who were much, much older than me. There were not people of color in the room, and everybody in the room had paid 700 some dollars to be there.
Wow.
But that is where the
Got
idea
it.
for the festival was born. We wanted to create something accessible and approachable that really reflected the values of our city. And yeah, so without Initiative 71, without the big vote that night, there would be no NCF. And without Initiative 71 and the big vote that night, we wouldn't have, the vibrant community that we have in the city today.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it reminds me of when you're talking about the sense of community. You absolutely feel that in National Cannabis Festival, and it was a big feature of why I think people liked the pop-ups when Initiative 71 first happened. So the pop-ups were sort of like a farmer's market that would happen generally at like restaurants, bars, nightclubs. Early on they would be on like the off nights. So like Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, you'd see some of these events going on, and then they grew in popularity, and you could find them every night of the week. But that's what was so crucial to their success early on is it felt like people were coming out of the cannabis closet, right? And in some cases, I feel like we've been rubbing elbows for years. I mean, some of us probably had the same dealers, right? We had to have. I know I found one guy that was in the same band that I was in. There was this guy who he had his own thing and he would recruit people to come in and play instruments or whatever. But my point is that we've been rubbing shoulders forever, and it was nice to actually be able to come together. And of course, NCF is sort of the ultimate expression of that, the National Cannabis Festival that really allows everybody to congregate over by RFK Stadium. Has it always been at RFK
It's
Stadium?
always been at RFK, yeah. That's, I
Right.
lived and grew up right around RFK, so I wanted to keep it close to home. One thing that I remember about when Initiative 71 became law was this like excitement and a little bit of anxiety from people. They just really wanted to find their way in. They're, oh my goodness, because I don't know do you remember the initial medical cannabis application process for the first group?
I remember, so I know from earlier research that when the medical program was first established in DC, like you basically had to be dying. You had to have cancer or AIDS or something very, very serious to even be
Right.
considered as a
And
patient.
for the dispensaries to actually, I don't remember there being a very public dispensary application process for the first round. I just remember becoming aware that there were suddenly dispensaries about to be opening in the city.
Hmm.
And I think that's true of many, many people in DC. So that when Initiative 71 became law, there was this excitement and anxiety to, I really want to be in on this. I want to get my opportunity on this. Like, what can I do to get ready so I can get my license? And that was sort of the first 2 years. We had all of these brands and business owners in the city, whether it was through pop ups or through something they were just doing privately for friends at home, that were really trying to establish themselves for these elusive licenses that I think maybe people were a little bit like me, not necessarily understanding the slow wheels of the legislative process. But I really truly think a lot of people thought, okay, we're going to have tax and regulate in a year or two, and I'm going to be ready. I'm going to have my brand ready. I'm going to be able to show people that I know how to run a delivery or a retail space. And then the years ticked on, and things evolved from there. But I do think that that's something very important that I think people understand across the board in DC, or I really hope they do, that these entrepreneurs weren't and aren't trying to cause any trouble. They were excited and ready to be part of a regulated system. I don't think any of us, and I speak of us being like the lay people in the city who may not have been as in tune with how policy works around here, could have imagined that close to 7 years later, we still wouldn't have a more decisive picture of what, DC regulations will look like under an adult use market. So that's something that I would like everybody to remember, that the people who are running what people call gray market businesses or unregulated businesses or, even legacy businesses do have very good intentions. And I think that when we're talking about Initiative 71 and some of the, hard feelings or conflicts that we've seen, occur as the laws have been interpreted by people, that we have to remember there are very good people on all sides of this.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. The accessibility to becoming part of the cannabis industry is simply too tempting for a lot of people. I described it early on as like, you know, I could make money and help people at the same time. Are you kidding me? Like and I could be my own business. Like, why wouldn't I sign up for this? I absolutely want this. Um, and that's how we've got this rich, diverse group of entrepreneurs and people that are in key positions in these businesses if they're not the
Yeah.
owners themselves. Initiative 71 is overwhelmingly run by people of color, by women, by veterans, certainly more women earlier on, especially with the pop-up scene. That has been one of the bad parts of the pop-up scene kind of going away, is that there's been less female entrepreneurs in the space. But it just allows anybody to take part. You get an Instagram page and a logo, and you can be an I-71 brand tomorrow. And I really look at it as a rekindling of the American dream. In a way that's in short supply elsewhere. There's no other market for cannabis in the United States where you're going to find this level of diversity among the ownership. It doesn't exist. There's too many hurdles in the way, and there's too few licenses available. So this grand experiment that we've done, it has matured. It's worked out. There's not a whole lot of issues. We could absolutely do things to improve it, and I'm all about that. But in terms of how we did without, the government looking over our shoulder and making sure there's a seed to sale program and all that, I think we've done pretty good. I think we've acquit ourselves as a community pretty well. And I also use the we, even though I just run this website where all I do is talk about whether the weed's good or not. I've been in and around
Well, you're this
I-71 so
community,
long.
yeah.
So I identify with it, even though like I'm not actually running a brand myself.
No, I agree with all of that. I have been so impressed seeing the creativity and the ideas from people in our DC community. And I think, we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about some of the challenges that some of the medical companies have faced over the years. And perhaps it's not popular for me to give a little bit of props to the medical companies, but I will say that the medical dispensaries in DC have spent years working to make conditions for medical dispensaries to exist in DC better. So while we may not all agree on all things all the time, I can say that the work and the time and the effort that groups like the DC Medical Cannabis Trade Association have put in talking to the DC Council about things like plant limits, about curbside delivery, about caretakers being able to come in and pick up cannabis. A lot of those things didn't exist when we first got dispensaries, and they've been able to inch those pieces forward. So I appreciate them for that. I do appreciate that the owners of the dispensaries in DC have gone through a lot over the years to get open, to exist in a place where we don't have a real clear picture on how adult use could one day work. I'm certain they grabbed those licenses thinking
Oh
that in
yeah.
a couple of years it's going to be tax and regulate. So I imagine that there's been a lot of disappointment for them there too. But you touched on this earlier. It's even been in a couple of newspapers recently. A lot of the dispensary owners say that, they were coexisting with the gray market businesses just fine until COVID hit, and then challenges hit for everybody. You know, if I were to pin the blame on anyone in all of this for any hard feelings or any challenges that anyone's had, and you've been waiting for me to say this,
I'm
I've been
grinning.
waiting to say
I am
this,
grinning.
but it delights me to pin the blame on Congress because, like you said, when district residents voted 70% in favor of making Initiative 71 law, if Congress hadn't gotten in the way, at that moment, the DC mayor and the council would have been able to define and put in place an adult use system that we would all understand and get to work within and around, like whatever it is you do, but, you know, that we would have here that we could say is ours and that is made to work for our community. That didn't happen. And here we are today. Things are a little bit murky, but as you've pointed out, we've had some really great things come out of this, and we've had some really challenging things come out of this. But if Congress could get out of the way, if the tax code 280E could disappear, if we could make more opportunities available in DC, I think that we could have a lot of cannabis license opportunities for everyone to do really well, because ultimately I want to see all DC businesses win.
Yeah, and I think, you know, looking back, almost every brand that I've talked to that works under I-71 has at one time or another come to me and said, so Joe, how do we actually get licensed?
Exactly.
They want to be part of this. They've just been prevented up until now.
And for a lot of the companies that I've spoken to, they've treated their businesses like training for the real deal. Like, I'm going to know how to run a retail space. I'm going to know how to fulfill merch orders because I'm doing this and I'm doing that. So I hope that as we see the laws evolve in DC and as we get closer to an adult use system, that we get to start seeing workforce development programs and training programs and owner-operator training programs so that we can really talk to people about the details that go into running a licensed business, get everybody on the same page, make sure that we have the infrastructure in the city to provide real professional development beyond the point of licensure. If you look in California and Illinois and many other states with social equity programs running right now, oftentimes you'll see social equity owner-operators get the licenses but then not be able to sustain them because of costs or because of things that are just out of their reach. I would hate to see DC get too far ahead of itself. We start doling out these licenses, but we don't provide people with the support, financial, technical training, any of the support they need to have sustainable businesses. And then they end up selling those licenses to a big company. So I hope that doesn't happen here. And I think that because of folks like you, because of things like the I-71 committee, because of things like the DC Medical Cannabis Trade Association, because of groups like DCMJ, Drug Policy Alliance, we have enough eyes on the legislation in our city to hopefully ensure that when we do start moving forward, we're moving forward in a way that is thoughtful and that's taking into account the sacrifices of everybody. But most importantly, the people in our city that have been victimized repeatedly by the war on drugs.
Yeah, we're anticipating retail tax and sales coming to DC soon. Certainly not a given at this point, but it's looking good enough that city leadership is talking about it. And I really want to make sure that if you're out there listening, again, thank you so much for tuning in to our first podcast. If you want to support the Initiative 71 entrepreneurs and making sure that they get a seat at the table when we're talking about recreational sales, you can follow at I-71 Committee on Instagram and at Generational Equity Movement on Instagram. Onwards and upwards, folks. We'll talk to you next time.